Sí. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Good night. Buenas noches. Mi nombre es Edwin Meléndez. Soy el director del Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños. My name is Edwin Meléndez. I'm the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. The event has several layers to it. The documentary itself takes about half an hour. It's a beautiful piece of film. But before we do that, I'd like to do a couple of things. This case, the Mendez case, was the inspiration for one of the artists of the labor exhibit. For those of you who are not aware, let me tell you two words about what's going on. The Centro Library and Archive moved to 119th and 3rd Avenue. So I'm sure many of you are aware of that. And in a celebration of that move, we created an exhibit. We commissioned a few artists to create an exhibit in celebration of that event. And we have a couple of them tonight here, Professor Juan Sanchez and Miguel. And this particular case inspired one of the artists, and I want to invite him to come in 1 second, to create his contribution to that exhibit around this case. So what I'd like to do tonight is let Miguel say a few words about his work and how he was inspired by the case. That will move us to the documentary, and afterwards we will then bring Doña Sylvia and others to have a conversation. But before we get there, let me say two words. The Center for Puerto Rican Studies, for those of you who do not interact too much with us, is devoted to understanding the Puerto Rican experience in the U.S. And we do that through research, through the collection of archival material, through maintaining a first-rated library and library resources. We also sponsor events such as the one we're here tonight, and we do other things. We maintain a website and so on and so forth. We have conferences, but all revolving around the core mission of preserving, understanding, and sharing the Puerto Rican experience in the United States. There are brochures around, and I welcome you to come to other events. So it's my pleasure to leave with you Miguel Luciano, who's going to explain a little bit of what the exhibit is all about.
Great. To be hosting tonight the living history in Sylvia Méndez of the Mendez versus Westminster case. A little bit of background about the exhibition. The labor exhibition at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. It's in the new gallery in East Harlem on 119th and 3rd Avenue. And 5 artists were invited to do research in the archives around the theme of labor. And that research would then lead to the production of new work. This is an exhibition that was curated by Susana Torruella and Antonio Martorell. Antonio Martorell was also one of the participating artists, along with Juan Sanchez, Nitza Tufiño, Melissa Calderon, and myself. And so each of us found different aspects of our history that motivated us. And what I found was an extraordinary story of a migration of Puerto Ricans to Arizona in 1926, where Puerto Ricans were recruited actually as cotton workers to pick cotton in Arizona in the mid-20s. The sort of amazing part about that story is that it's also an important piece of labor history in Arizona, in that the Puerto Ricans, when they arrived, found conditions so deplorable that they refused to work under the living conditions and working conditions that they were forced to be in. So no running water, plumbing, no electricity in the housing, things like this. So they refused to work and they revolted, and there was an historic labor protest that formed. And that community, they stopped recruiting Puerto Ricans for the cotton industry in Arizona after this. But among that first family of migrants was the family of Felicitas Méndez. And her parents, she was a little girl at the time, her parents were part of that protest. They moved to California and continued to work in farming. And Felicitas Méndez married a man named, well, she married Gonzalo, Gonzalo Mendez, and the two of them go on to put their kids in school, in the local school, where their children are denied access to the all-white school. And there begins the story of Mendez versus Westminster, this historic civil rights case. These are a few images of the work in the exhibition. Let's see if I can get this to work. This is the installation. If you haven't got a chance to see the show, this is just one work in the show, but I highly encourage you to see it. The show's up through February on 119th and 3rd Avenue again. My story and the way that I told the story of this project was through this bike, a bike that was made by Schwinn in 1971, and it was called the Cotton Picker. So 1970, 1971, Schwinn actually produced a bike called the Cotton Picker. I was looking at issues of migration and labor, working with the Puerto Rico Schwinn Club. It has been a theme in my work, working with bicycles and sculptural works, and started looking for these links between Puerto Rican and cotton picking, and sure enough, there was this incredible story of our history. And so I used the bike to sort of tell the story, begin telling the story. And here the bike is really represented as the artifact that it is. I just restored this classic bike from the 70s. And then embellished a vest in honor of Felicitas Méndez, the mother of Sylvia Méndez, with buttons and pins that reflect on a history of labor and the civil rights movement that are part of the archives. These are artifacts from the archives that they allow me to display, that extend sort of the Mendez case into a larger trajectory of civil rights. So these are just a few images. I invite you all to come and visit the work in the gallery. All of the work in the show is tremendous. I'm very proud of the work, and very proud to have really learned about this history through this project, doing research in the archives at Centro, and to connect it to this event this evening. So with that, I will now play the documentary. So with that, I would love to present, it's my distinct privilege and honor to introduce to you lifelong civil rights activist and recipient of Presidential Medal of Freedom, here with her sister, Sandra, Sylvia Méndez. You can stand up. Thank you. And Sylvia, Doña Sylvia, if you would join us here. I'm going to invite for the Q&A now Doña Sylvia to join us here at the table. And also I would like to invite Juan Cartagena, who is here to lead the Q&A, who's the President and General Counsel of Latino Justice for PRODEF, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. And before we begin, I would like to invite John Santana from the Puerto Rico Federal Affairs Administration here to make a presentation.
Thank you. The Puerto Rico Federal Affairs Administration represents the Governor's Office of Puerto Rico here in New York City, and we represent the Northeast and Florida, and wherever there's Puerto Ricans, that's where we reach out to. When we found out that La Señora Mendez was going to be here, made it a point, thank you to Rolando for reaching out, Roberto, excuse me, and let the governor know that Ms. Mendez was going to be present here, and that it would be an opportunity for us, or for him to actually recognize her. He has sent a letter, a message. I'll read it just briefly. As you gather at Hunter College with members and friends of the Puerto Rican community in New York, I want you to know that your legacy also means a great deal to your brothers and sisters back in the mother's homeland of Puerto Rico. In you, Sylvia, Puerto Rico was present in righting a wrong and opening a new chapter in American history, one in keeping with the nation's noblest ideas and promise. Thanks to Mendez, Westminster, and the subsequent Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Ed, that it made possible, the circle of educational opportunity in America was widened to include all children. And I'm going to finish off. On behalf of the people of Puerto Rico, we salute you for your courage, your conviction, and your ongoing example for the future. May God bless and continue to bestow upon you abundant blessings. Sincerely, Luis G. Fortunio.
Let's, I'd like to have an opportunity for Sylvia to say a few words first, huh? And then we'll open this up for questions.
I just want to thank everybody that made this possible for my sister Sandra, Duran Mendez, and myself to be here in this wonderful college.
Thank you. One of the amazing things about both the documentary and this case, I've been using the documentary in a course that I teach at Rutgers in New Brunswick, a law course for undergraduate students. And I've always been using it for a lot of the themes that you saw expressed in the documentary. The convergence of all those issues leading and giving way to the incredible courage of this family to do something against overt discrimination. The internment of Japanese Americans in the United States, the leasing of the land to a Mexican Puerto Rican family, and the incredible connections between Robert Carter and Thurgood Marshall with respect to the arguments that were being made in this case in Mendez versus Westminster has always been something of incredible fascination to me as a civil rights attorney. I want to just point out a couple of points real quickly about the case, the opinion itself that I've been using in the coursework that I've been doing. There were about 5,000 at the time children of Mexican or Latin descent, as they were described in the court opinion in this case. This case is a 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause case. California state law allowed for the segregation, as you heard in the documentary. And the incredible arguments that you heard in the documentary that the fact that you provide the same facilities and same kind of textbooks to children, even though you segregate them on the basis of their race or ethnicity, is not equal. And the notion about inferiority just by segregation alone is probably the linchpin that convinced the judges in that case to do this in this case. The role of Earl Warren and Thurgood Marshall have already been described in the documentary. There was some defense in the case. Some of the school districts tried to defend the segregation of school children on the basis of language. They were trying to argue that the segregation of Mexican kids was necessary in order to provide them with an opportunity to address their language needs. But the record also demonstrated that that was never applied across the board, that there were children of various language backgrounds who were just segregated because of their ethnicity, their race, and their Spanish surnames. And finally, Judge Robert Carter, who you saw at the very beginning of the documentary, is an incredibly forceful advocate who also is an icon in the struggle for civil rights and constitutional rights in this country. When he got on the bench, he actually was a judge, a sitting judge here in the Southern District of New York, which sits in Manhattan. And he had been, when I started the Puerto Rican Defense Fund in the 1970s and 80s, a judge on a couple of the employment and housing discrimination cases that we brought as well. His opinions were always impeccably reasoned, and usually, since we were always in the right, he always had the right decision to give us, right? He was an incredible judge, and I love the fact that this documentary also opened up with his thoughts about the connections between Mendez and Brown versus Board of Education. The issue of segregation of our children today, and this is what I'm sure is something that Sylvia is very tuned to, was at that time in our history something, the product of what we call de jure segregation, segregation by operation of law. But the issue of segregation of especially Latino children today is a product of what the courts called de facto segregation. Well, that is segregation because that's the way it happens to be. But the fact of the matter is that many of our children, not many, a far majority of our children in this country actually attend highly segregated schools, incredibly segregated schools, where the only people that they interact with are also Latinos and Latinas. And the fact that we as a society have just turned another cheek, another way to just look the other way while children are not being able to expose themselves as a result of a complex of issues having a lot to do with housing and availability of housing, the availability of affordable housing, and the remnants of decades and decades and decades of discrimination, both in the area of housing and in the area of education, has resulted in a problem that still needs to be addressed. So I would love for anyone even now just to pose some questions to Doña Sylvia Méndez about her wonderful work now, because she has not stopped being an advocate, and her tireless ability to be, say, presente whenever this issue comes up, and as an incredible advocate for the issues that emanate from this case, and to give some observations about what you think are some of the broader issues that this documentary has presented for you.
If I may, Doña Sylvia, this is a case in which legal action, this is a case in which legal action actually promotes social change and has profound consequences in the life of so many children. Can you speak a little bit, and then it's forgotten what caused all that social change, and now we're recovering a little bit of that history for generations to come. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences in terms of the changes that occurred as a consequence of this legal battle, and how that was the mechanism at the time that was called for to promote this social change?
Well, I hope I can answer that. What happened was that at the time that we were being segregated, they were saying that we didn't speak, just like he said, English, and that we had to be segregated. And as I started to go around the country and talking about Mendez, trying to inspire students to stay in school, that's my whole intention. Going around to talk to students, letting them know how Latinos have always fought for their children. I found out that we were more segregated now than we were in 1947 when I was segregated. And that's when I started thinking about what can I do? What can I do to help? Well, one of the things was to tell the story, the Mendez story, about how Latinos have always fought for education, how Latino parents have always wanted the best for their children, knowing that education is what's going to get them there. And that was to inspire students to stay. And then I discovered that going from college to college, school to school, that we were more segregated than ever before. Then I thought, what can I do? And that's when I decided that I would continue telling the story, but also emphasizing that I know that Mendez got rid of, by law, the desegregation, as he mentioned, and now we have de facto segregation. And the two schools that are named after my mother and father in Santa Ana are 100% Latino. What does that tell you? That we're more segregated than ever. But the whole thing is that we are not to ever give up on educating our children and letting them know how important education is. So now my emphasis has turned from just telling the story about Mendez versus Westminster, and how Latinos have always been there, and how this Puerto Rican woman, as you all saw, my mother is Puerto Rican, and how this is not just a Mexican thing, because my mother was Puerto Rican and my father was Mexicano, how Latinos have always fought for their children to stay in school and have wanted the best. And so my new emphasis was to go and inspire the students. Yes, I know you're in the schools that are 99% Latinos, like the two schools that are named after my parents, but that cannot stop you from learning. No matter what obstacles, I tell the students, no matter what there is, there's only yourself, just like Roosevelt says, who do you have to fear but just yourself? And that's what I do now. I just go around talking to students about how important education is, and how people continue to fight, just like you are speaking today about education, just like we have all these professors here, just like I work with so many leaders, educational leaders that are working so hard to get rid of all the stigma that we have and everything that's blocking us from becoming integrated in the schools. I want to let the students know that we have people continuing, just like my parents worked and fought for education. We have so many people that continue to work for Latinos and for all students and minorities, for them to get educated. Right now I'm working in California with so many And our governor, I have to tell you that our governor, I have been working so hard on the DREAM Act, and our governor just passed some very strong legislation in California where our DREAM Act is going to, our students are going to get funded, and we have been working so hard. So I want our students to know that we are here for them, and we will continue to always be there fighting, working for them, and that there is always somebody there that will help them. And I know that we are, in some of the schools are very poor, just like the two schools that are named after my parents. But I go and speak to those students and tell them, this is not going to stop you. You are going to succeed, and it's up to you to succeed, and we are all there for you. And that is the difference that I see from the time when I was a little girl and my parents were fighting for me and for me to have an equal education. And what happens? We continue. Look at this group, the people in this room. We're all working together to try and end this. And when I go to universities like Georgia, or where I'm asked to go, Arkansas, Illinois, wherever I go to any university, I tell them, the students, you are the ones that have to get rid of de facto segregation. I don't know how to do it, but it's in your future, the new students, the new leaders of this world that will have to get rid of it, because there has to be a solution, that we cannot continue with this terrible thing that's going on where we have de facto segregation, and segregation just keeps getting worse and worse, discrimination, and it's only our youth and our leaders and the ones that have to keep on working, helping us get rid of that stigma that we have of discrimination and segregation and all those things that are going on. So I was so proud when Obama gave me the Medal of Freedom, and I think what he did was when he inspired me to continue to talk to students. That's what he did. He gave me the Medal of Freedom, and this is just a little sample of the big one that he gave me, and what he wanted was for me to continue talking to students to inspire them to stay in school and to get educated. And it was also an honor for my mother, the Puerto Rican woman that fought so hard taking care of that farm so my father could go out there working so hard with a lawyer to end segregation in California. Thank you.
My question is about the adults, because I know a bit more about Black children who were integrated in white schools and the difficulties they faced, and then Black people started to question, well, was integration really the answer? Perhaps we could seek community control of our schools, since the children were mistreated and sometimes put in separate classrooms or tracked differently. They had totally different curriculum. So they weren't segregated in the building, however, they weren't segregated in separate school buildings, but however, in one building, there was this tracking and mistreatment and segregation. So I'm wondering if there was any of that, and if there were any people in the community who saw the complexity of integration.
I think that was the main purpose, that everybody got together to fight segregation, because they saw the unequal education that the Latinos were getting. We would get handed down books. We were being taught how to be maids, how to work in the fields. We were not getting academic classes like English, math. That's not what our curriculum was at the time. It was more home economics in the Mexican schools. How we were treated? We were treated very bad. You couldn't speak Spanish, and you didn't know how to speak English, so that was a dilemma there. And if you tried to speak Spanish, you were punished. You were hit with rulers, or you were punished by being placed on a corner, or I remember I knew how to speak English, and that was one of the things that they were saying, that's why they were desegregating us, but that was not true. But I remember from the other students that did not know how to speak English, how they were punished because they would speak Spanish in the schools. So the treatment was not equal anywhere for the Latinos. One thing I have to tell you that happened during this time, was that in the Mendez case, nothing like what happened in the South. Nothing like that happened to us. The discrimination that went on during the trial and what was my father was confronted was nothing like what the South. The South. I remember the nine that that walked out, that were brought to the school. What's Little Rock. Nothing like that happened to us when we were integrated in California. The only thing that my father ever had to hear was that he was being called a communist, because that was terrible to be a communist at the time. But nothing like what happened in the South happened in the integration. The integration in California went very peacefully. That's the difference between then and here. I hope I answered your question.
Well, interestingly enough, the strategic decision by the Brown versus Board of Education attorneys out of the NAACP was to concede, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that the facilities of black children and white children in Kansas and the other cases that were consolidated in Brown were actually equal. They literally conceded that. They made the argument, we accept the premise that the schools in both of these parts of town have the same facilities, same textbooks, same level of teaching, and same outcomes. Because in order for them to attack head-on the notion that separation of races by its own nature is inherently a violation of the Constitution, they had to get past that, well, you know, the reality. Because otherwise, the answer from the court would have easily been, well, then make the black schools a little better. Pour some more money and make the black schools slightly better so that you could still have separate but equal without being the doctrine of the day, which dominated, as you know, American jurisprudence for decades before that. So to consider the strategic decision of Robert Carter and Thurgood Marshall is really amazing. For them to sit before the highest court in the country and not question or contest the notion that black kids in Kansas were actually going to the same level of schooling facilities as white children is amazing, but their strategy worked. And now, as you raise the question about control and the ability of school districts to deal with the reality of segregation, both housing and otherwise, is a very complex question, and we haven't seen it all played out. We know that when you really scratch the surface of today's segregated schools, that they're not receiving the same level of inputs, of resources as other public schools in other parts, perhaps not of the city, but definitely of the state. So when you go across the entire spectrum of schools of the entire state, you will see differentiations in school resources available to schools depending on where they're located in the state. That should be a separate violation of a separate principle.
And that's what we're working in California right now. Some of those segregated schools don't have AP classes. They don't have counselors. They don't even know what classes to take to get to college, and they graduate from school and think they can go into college, and they can't because they haven't taken the appropriate classes or been guided directly. And we're working so hard right now to try and take care of that problem in California.
Anybody else?
Ready, but she never did. So my mother thought everything was going to go fine, that we were going to have integrated schools, we weren't going to have discrimination anymore. But when she became very ill, I went on to college and became a registered nurse, and I was a registered nurse for 33 years. And I became assistant nursing director, and I was real happy to finally have made it to be assistant nursing director of the hospital. But my mother became very ill, and what I say, you know, just like all Latinas and all Puerto Ricans, you have to take care of your mother. So I quit to take care of my mother, and my mother would say, Sylvia, nadie sabe de este caso. Cómo peleamos por todos los niños. Nobody knows about this case, how we fought for integration, how we fought for these kids. This is history. This is history of California. This is history of the United States. This is history how the Latinos have fought for education. And that was the day that I promised my mother that I would start going around the country talking about this historical event that happened in the United States that nobody knew. And the way that I did it, I was a nurse, and I was used to saying, turn around, I'm going to give you a shot, or open your mouth, I'm going to give you a pill. I was so scared. I'll never forget the first day I got in front of a class, I was like shaking. And I sent out letters to all the universities. I'll come and tell you a story of history of California, history of the United States. And they started inviting me. I remember being in front of this class, and my legs were like rubber. I thought they were going to. And the students are the ones that told me. And I said, I'm going to tell you history of California you don't know. I'm going to tell you history of the United States. And it was the students that encouraged me. And I told them, I'm going to give you this little paper, and you evaluate me. You tell me if this is worth telling. And it was these students that told me, Sylvia, don't be scared. Tell us, we love the story. Just next time, bring us some pictures. Bring us some handouts so we'll know more about the story. And that's how I started. And that's the legacy I made my mother. It was almost like 15 years ago. And finally, the story is finally getting around. And finally getting around that it wasn't just Mexicanos. It was also Puerto Rican ladies. So it's a Latino story about all Latinos, how they have always wanted the best for their children and how they always fought for education.
Sure. One of the most amazing things about the legal history in this case and its relation to Brown is that the opinion actually in Mendez versus Westminster addresses a social construct of race as it was played out in the 1940s and 50s in California, and that is, although Mexicans were supposed to be segregated, when they weren't classified as Indian, they were or deemed white. Years later in Texas, there's a very important case called Hernandez versus Texas, which in the law books, today, by the way, this doesn't happen because everybody does legal research online, so you don't get the flavor of what I'm talking about unless you're my age. But when I was in school, you open the book. You open the volume of the book that has Brown versus Board of Education. You take it off the shelf, and when you open it, you read Brown. At the end of the last page of Brown, you turn the page by happenstance, and there's Hernandez versus Texas. Probably the most important Supreme Court case, because remember, Mendez versus Westminster was decided at the appellate court level, didn't go all the way to the Supreme Court. It won, it didn't have to go up any further. But the Hernandez case does this incredible another chapter of legal history for Latinos in this country, because it actually demonstrates, the first case that ever applies the Equal Protection Clause to a group of people that's not black. It was the other white of Texas's Jim Crow. It was the segregated part of Texas, which was clearly segregated according to all the evidence. It's elaborated in a wonderful book called Colored Men, Hombres Aquí, which were the signs that were put up in the public restrooms in the very Texas court in which the case was argued. Hombres Aquí, they were segregated public restrooms. So the entire history of Mexican American lawyering is told from the vantage point of that case, and how it played out subsequently was to apply the concepts of the entire Constitution to a class of people that were not neither black nor white. And that's what the ruling in Hernandez, that the Equal Protection Clause is not just interpreted in a black-white theory. It also applies to other groups. It's an incredible piece of our history as well. But you had a question right here, no? Un comentario.
Yes.
Sí.
First of all, I wanted to address Sylvia. My sister, Alice Apodaca from Orange County, told me I had to come
Thank you.
and greet you, and if I didn't, she left yesterday to go back to Orange County.
Repeat her name, because we didn't.
Alice Apodaca.
Okay.
From the national.
She was the one that told me about the case.
Okay.
And one of the things that moved me was, in our society, different cultural groups are divided, and they use that to keep us. And your story, what really moved me was that you had Japanese, Puerto Rican, Mexican, and white together.
Mm-hmm.
And I just would like you to tell me about that part of the case with the Japanese and the different cultures working together.
Well, one thing I always tell the students, this Mendez versus Westminster is not just about Mexicans fighting, it's about everybody coming together, because the person that introduced my father to the Japanese family, the Minomitsos that were going to be interned, was their banker, and he was white. And he's the one that was my dad's friend and the Japanese friend. And then the Japanese family that we took care of their farm was so grateful when they came back from being interned that they allowed my dad to stay there and grow a crop and make enough money to go back to where he was and buy another cantina, because he had spent all his money with a lawyer and fighting this case. And that was the Japanese family that was so good to us. The Jewish Congress came in, the Jewish lawyer, Marcus, that decided to make it a class action suit, was wonderful. He's the one that decided to get all the families together. Then we had the NACP that came in, Thurgood Marshall, that wrote the briefs and later used those for Brown versus the Board of Education. And then we had the Civil Liberty. So everybody came in and helped. And this is what I tell students: when you know there's something wrong and you want to make it right, and you go around talking and telling the story, you will have people of all nationalities coming to help you. As long as you know you're right and people know they're right, we all gather when we know there is an injustice to be right. And this is what happened in Mendez. Everybody joined in to help in Mendez.
Right there.
Thank you. My name is Camilo Romero, and I'm a current law student here in New York. And hearing about this case is a case I heard about well before I ever discovered that the law could be part of the solution, not just part of the problem. I've become a little bit nostalgic, if not worried, with the fact that, in fact, here at this presentation, a pair of mentees from a high school debate program that have joined us here, that I talk about the law in a very hopeful and very proactive way. That the fact that we are sitting here and that there's a Latino director, Latino justice, and a pioneer like Sylvia Méndez in front of us is obviously proof that we've come a long way. Yet the nostalgia worry piece is that despite that fact, today, like it was back in that day, communism is still a very bad thing. Maybe it's not less dramatic as the governor of Georgia or George Wallace, governor of Alabama, but now it's Nathan Deal and Robert Bentley. So I begin to see that history is reoccurring, and the generational change perhaps is certainly a pendulum, but I'm beginning to lose some of that hope that I would like to convey to those that are even younger than me. And so the question is more, and my family still remains in fact in Orange County. My mom and my grandma are in Costa Mesa, so this is something that's particularly a dear case to me. I wonder, from your personal experience, perhaps anyone else in the room, what has really changed? What's been problems that you share when you speak to other young people about what has changed? Because I would like to think I'm too young to be losing that type of optimism, but certainly the law has proven to be cowardly before. The Mendez case is an exception. We can go through all kinds of cases where the law, in fact, has preferred to not be in the interest of justice and equality.
The period of the 1940s, 50s echoed an incredibly longer period of what I would call state-sponsored, government-sponsored terroristic acts against our people. This is the government that we elect, the government that we support through our tax dollars, whether we are allowed to elect them or not, engaged in vigilantism, engaged in looking the other way when vigilantism occurred, and engaged in state-sponsored terror against the people that we all represent in this room because of the language that they speak, the accents that they speak English with, their Spanish surnames, their skin colors, and the national countries that they've come from. The entire history of the United States has yet to be fully told for Latinos when it comes to state-sponsored terror. So the first thing that I would notice that's different between today and those days is that at least I know that if any one of us in this room gets lynched from a tree in America just because we're Latino or Latina, that I have the faith that some level of authority will do its best to weed out who did it and bring those people to justice. We have been victims of racially sponsored, government-sponsored terrorism for decades in this country, particularly in the Southwest, where bands of people who are Mexicanos, who are Spanish, who came from Central America, who came from Puerto Rico, and were all lumped into the other category of just being Spanish, were intimidated to be chased off their lands, intimidated when they tried to vote, and then victims of outrageous terroristic threats. I'll end this little part of this answer with this footnote. What we call today the Texas Rangers was a mob that used guns that they got from the state of Texas to create vigilante groups to chase, hunt down, and create terroristic acts against Mexicanos in Texas and to everywhere else they operated. I understand your point, because I fully understand it. We are not in the business of thinking that we have gone so far that we can just put our feet up and just relax, that we reached this amazing mountaintop. We're not at a post-racial period at all, despite the election of President Obama. We are at a point where if we don't continue to fight for these issues, we will slide. Alabama today is sliding, has slid. You cannot walk the streets of Alabama without being concerned about your safety. In fact, you just can't do it at all. In Alabama's example, following on the footsteps of Arizona, is an incredible episode of what it means for us to continue to be vigilant. But I had the hope that at least the outrageous features of the worst parts of Jim Crow and Juan Crow have subsided. That might not be saying much, right? When you think about what I just finished saying, coño, all he's saying is at least I don't have to get killed. But what about the rest of my life? Or what about the rest of my ability to make a living? Well, how can I raise a family in this environment no matter what? And on those points, I hear you. You know, we talked at the beginning of this conversation about the jure segregation and de facto segregation. We still have to attack segregation as it stands. Otherwise, we lose ground.
That was a beautiful answer. I loved it.
Well, how about his question about how do we not lose hope?
Well, we don't lose hope, but we continue to fight. And that continuing to fight by being educated and knowing how to fight and by believing in our law. And right now, yes, we know about what happened in Arizona, but we have the National Lawyers Association blocking some of those laws that were made there. So we have people working to stop some of these horrible things that are happening. It's not just being slighted. It's not like, yes, it's happening and nobody thinks about it and we're going to let it happen. We're not going to let it happen. We have lawyers that are fighting it right now. And if are you going to be a lawyer? And so I'm going to depend on you to continue this fight, because it's people like you, young people like you, that have to carry on for us. And that's why I go to colleges. That's why I speak to students, because it's you. You are the ones that have to carry the torch and make it succeed someday. Because we are not there. We are more segregated than we were in 1946. And discrimination and bias, it all continues.
Thank you.
Well, we want to end with this message of hope and optimism. What I'd like to do more than anything now is thank Doña Sylvia and her sisters, Sandra, for coming all the way from California tonight. To Juan for being generous enough to monitor this, to Miguel for hosting our invited guests, and thank you for coming tonight.